All right, thank you, everyone. Only 4 minutes late. I think that's a record for a 5:30 meeting, but I'd like to call this meeting to order. Appreciate everyone being here. The Public Safety Committee. The first agenda item is the review and approval of the November 7th, 2022 minutes. So moved to approve. Second? Second. All in favor? Aye? Aye, great. Okay, so those are approved. The second docket item, and the only one we really have to chat about today, is a communication that was originally referred to the Public Safety Committee on October 3rd from myself, Councilman Bullock, and Councilman Schachtner regarding speed enforcement trends. We also had a really robust discussion with the administration, mostly law, planning, and the police department back in November to talk about, some trends and what we can do from an enforcement standpoint to help public safety and help bring down speeds in our communities. And also wanted to kind of get a handle on some of the data that we collected because, we talked about in November that sure feels like people are going faster, but we'd like to have some information to kind of back up some of that stuff. Looks like the slides are being pulled now. So to give a little context of where we've been and where we left off from our meeting in November, we left off that basically, some of the action items that we thought were potentially helpful would be to do a speed overtime detail with our police department, particularly focusing on school zones. And then we would also collect some data from those school zones to see what they reveal. And then even exploring different enforcement mechanisms such as traffic cameras. The law department did some really good research about what's required under Ohio law. It's quite burdensome, but there are special categories if you do it in school zones that exempt you from some of the onerous requirements, but there still are onerous requirements as I understand them. So, that's where we are today, and I'd like to turn it over to Assistant Planning Director Boss to kind of go over some of the data. From what I understand, he has his own traffic and speed counters, and then for the planning department has, and then the police department has some, so he had to smooth the data to create a appreciable data set that we could go over. So, Assistant Director Boss.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For members of council, I appreciate the time. I'll try to be quick here. I just wanted to show you just a quick snapshot, and this is a snapshot. I want to kind of offer that note up front. This is one data set, one, kind of period in time back in December that we were able to get the recorders out there. And I'm just highlighting Clifton. My assumption kind of going into this quick look was that the two schools, Emerson and Lincoln on Clifton, would probably have the highest probability or highest proportion of speeding in relation to a school zone. Just based on the characteristics of Clifton and the general traffic volume that flows through there. We did collect data on Horace Mann and Hayes, which is a little different. Hayes, especially in a more of a neighborhood setting, and Horace Mann on West Clifton's a little different. I have not been able to go through those in detail, but I wanted to share just these two summaries. So the slide that's in front of you right now this is a general picture of the traffic on Clifton in both of these school zones. So both the data was taken with our radar recorder, trying to position it kind of centrally in that school zone to get as accurate a picture as possible. And what you see in I understand it's probably difficult to see the graphs at the top, but you have the Lincoln school zone on the left, Emerson school zone on the right. You can see the general kind of pattern of that morning peak and then that evening peak. I don't have all the details. It's interesting to me that the morning peak is much smaller than the evening peak. But what you can see here in the proportions at the bottom, they're broken down, is that that traffic proportions there, 35 miles an hour or below, 35 to 45, and that variable zone that people travel in. And then what I would probably characterize on a 35 mile an hour street as excessive would be 45 or higher. You can see those proportions. 45 or higher is probably what would be expected, about 1 to 2%. Pretty low level. The majority of traffic there in that morning time frame, and this is general, kind of that morning time frame. The majority of traffic is going 35 or below. And then you can see in the evening, it kind of shifts that 55% consistent into that kind of that second category. And so this is a general picture across the board. If you look at both of those graphs, that red line, that's your 45 and higher, and it's pretty low. You can see the high peaks there in terms of those numbers, those call-out numbers. When you're looking at 12, 13, 14,000 cars a day flowing through Clifton, the number of 22 people going 45 miles an hour or higher during the 5 to 6 p.m. rush hour is a pretty low number. And so I just highlight that, again, noting that this is a single data set, 1 week in December, averaged out. When let me see if I can go to the next, there we go. So then when you kind of adjust the focus a little bit, as these are school zones, both of these, the schools in session during the weeks that we collected the data, if you just focus the data on when the lights are flashing, I'll say, and the speed limit shifts to 20 miles an hour or lower, and that's from generally 8 to 9 in the morning, 3 to 4 in the afternoon, was the criteria that we used in terms of the data collection for this, as this is part of that larger data set. So I had to dive back down into that kind of that hourly data that's there. You start to see something a little bit different. And there you can see a fairly consistent proportion of the traffic in the Lincoln zone. About 25% is going 30 miles an hour or higher. That's a concern, and it's fairly consistent between the morning and the evenings.
And Assistant Director Ross, I believe the school zone speed limit is 20 miles per hour, is that correct?
It's 20 miles an hour.
Okay, sorry, I just wanted to.
So that's why I kind of use that similar 10 miles an hour kind of grace or variable in there that someone may be, it's not like everybody enters the school zone going 20 miles an hour, and it's not like they leave it going 35. There's definitely a deceleration, acceleration. There's different points of, awareness of, oh my gosh, it's a school zone. Although I will, both school zones are positioned in and around a signalized intersection. There's flashing lights, there's signage. But what the stark contrast there at Emerson, you can see the morning time frame there at Emerson. The traffic that's going 30 miles an hour higher and 35 or higher is in that 1 to 2%, consistent with the general trends for the whole street all the time. And then it jumps significantly in the afternoon to almost that 35% of the traffic is going 30 miles an hour or higher. That's in contrast to 25% at Lincoln, which I would, I guess, in my opinion, I would consider that high, and 35% is obviously higher there. So this is, again, one snapshot in time, 1 week of looking at these zones, but in terms of average numbers every day, what that tells you is that in both of these school zones in the morning, it's about 210, 211 vehicles going above 30 miles an hour, and in the afternoon that more than doubles to 571 vehicles above 30 miles an hour. So kind of going back to what I'll end on, the last committee meeting that we had, in terms of using data in terms of intelligence to try to inform enforcement and focused enforcement, obviously that, Emerson in the afternoon would be a kind of a key target area in time, and then in Lincoln in the morning and in the afternoons, which I know, and the police are out there and they're doing this, and this is just kind of I believe this is a good example of a follow-up to that earlier discussion, to say that this is the level of fidelity that we're trying to shoot for to get to with the data that we collect, to then pass that off to the enforcement side so they can more efficiently and accurately direct their limited resources in terms of the locations where the speeding's occurring. And so Mr. Chair, that's what I would offer from these two slides. pending any good questions.
Thank you, Assistant Director Boss. And that's, I mean, I guess in school zones at least, right? So we're focusing our discussion to think that, 35% of cars that drive through are going 10 miles per hour over the speed limit, while kids 11 years of age, 11 and under, are walking to home. And on the flip side, 1 out of every 4 cars at Lincoln were kids 11 and under, right? It's a fifth grade and under school. That's pretty stark to me, but perhaps because I, envision my own child crossing the street during those instances. And I appreciate this data. I mean, it's certainly eye-opening. And before we move on to kind of a discussion with the police department, I welcome any questions that Madam Chair or committee members or other members of council may have. Councilwoman Marks.
Thank you. I noticed that you have no studies done in Ward 4, Garfield and Harrison. And there's a lot of pedestrian foot traffic there in the morning and at the schools crossing multiple streets. Have you done any studies in those areas? Because there's a real concern on Franklin.
Not yet, but I mean, we can definitely add those. This was just a matter of availability and of fitting the collections in and around all the other streets that we still are working through for traffic calming, fitting it in, so.
Because there is a concern in Ward 4 on crossing Franklin. There aren't crosswalks, and we have kids crossing Franklin to go to Garfield and kids crossing Franklin to go to Harrison. So I think we really need to pay some attention to that because there's a lot of speeding on Franklin. So I'd like a study done in that area. Thank you.
If there's no other questions from other members of the committee, I would, and this is, if we were to go and think about traffic cameras for school zones, which I think is part of a larger discussion with the police, law administration, to the extent it could free up resources for law enforcement to enforce speeding and, other traffic violations across the city. As I understand, and I direct this question to the law department, particularly Director Vargo, is we would need some sort of study to show, justification for traffic cameras. As I understand, the code doesn't explain what that means. A data set like this, I assume, would be somewhat applicable, but I'm curious as to your thoughts on that.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. The statute does require studies of all incidents without defining what an incident is, but we would presume that that is a speeding incident together with accidents or any other incident we would see in the study. The study would have to be done in each of the school zones. So, Councilperson Marks, we would have to put up the cameras in all of the school zones that we intend to use cameras for. And by cameras, I mean study cameras to collect data similar to what we just saw. And you're right, Mr. Chair, the statute doesn't say what the studies are, but that's a great study we just saw. That certainly would be part of the study. It's a 3-year requirement. I think law could work with planning, put together a protocol and process to implement for the study, identify the cameras, the facilities that we just used for this data point, set those out for each of the school zones, bring it back to the committee, and let you know that that would be the process that we would implement and get the study going whenever directed.
Thank you, Law Director Vargo. And I believe there's a question from Councilman Bullock.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Sorry for not being able to join at the beginning. I'm coming in the middle. This is great data. My question on this slide is just the context, which I may have missed. So this is done partly as a request of the discussion in this committee, if I follow, and secondly, is there a conclusion or recommendation that flows from this slide, or this is just data for now and we haven't gotten that far?
This is just one set of data Councilman, just to inform or support the discussion.
Okay.
I mean, typically, I mean, for our traffic calming cases, typically we require, 2, 3, 4, 5 sets of data before you start making any kind of conclusions based on, and you want to space those. As the law director highlighted, a 3-year period, you space those out over time, different seasons, different conditions, so that you have that kind of an accurate picture as to how the traffic performs over time.
I mean, you've been doing that with the traffic calming project all over town. So I would hope we don't have to start from scratch in January 1 of 2023 and wait until January 1 of 2024 to have enough of a foundation of the understanding of our traffic patterns. I mean, I think we know. Now, in this exact intersection or that exact spot, appreciate your points, but this is reminding me of similar slides we've seen in the past where you've got, so it's not quite the 80-20 rule, and you also, but you see the light red and the dark red in about the same proportion. A lot of those traffic calming studies, and also the afternoon tends to be worse. We don't have days of the week here, and that's okay. But there's some patterns that I think we see consistently, right, across.
So this data set this represents the average across all weekdays. So it's average Monday through Friday.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Councilman. And understood, and I want to make sure the public understands too, and I want to reiterate Assistant Director Boss's point that, this is one snapshot. So I don't think we should make our whole public policy decision based on this one, but, perhaps there's some confirmation bias in these numbers because they're spelling out what I felt. But we'll need to do more, I think, gathering and depending on what enforcement trend we wanted to go with, whether it was cameras or just law enforcement, pulling people over the old-fashioned way. So speaking of that, would like to, have Chief Kauchek kind of explain, without divulging, any law enforcement strategy that would not be appropriate for a public meeting, but kind of what the theory was behind the overtime detail, whether that's sustainable, and kind of your observations of it. Would really appreciate that.
All right, so, I mean, if you looked at Mr. Boss's graphs, you saw that the busy times were in the afternoons and mornings, which are typically busy times for the police department. We're handling other calls at that time when some people are coming out from work or whatever they're doing. So we started an overtime detail, 3 shifts per week, 3 hours per shift, where they just run radar, hopefully covering over the school zones when they did it. We started in December. We had about 2 weeks in December, which would have been 6 shifts because then school let out, so we didn't run it while school was out. And then we started back up again when school came back into session, so we've been going now for about 2 weeks now. So we've had a total possibility of 12 shifts that we could have run. We ended up filling 8 of those 3-hour shifts for a total of 24 hours on the overtime detail. I think before Christmas or right after Christmas, guys didn't really want any more overtime than they already had. We were loading them on, just covering shift and stuff like that, so, with the holidays. But anyhow, in that 24 hours of the overtime detail, we issued a total of 26 speeding citations. 15 of those were for school zone violations. And some of the others were, although not technically school zone violations, they were close to the school zones, like getting speeders coming down Waterbury by the St. Ed's school zone there, right to Detroit, and they're speeding to get there, whether it's kids going to school or parents dropping kids off, things of that nature. So I think it's been pretty productive so far. Just to put it in context, in 2019, we wrote 251 radar tickets for the year. 2020 and 2021 were COVID years, but we wrote 136 and 133 for those years. And in 2022, we wrote 334 radar citations. So far this year, including the tickets that we have through the overtime detail, we've written 59 speed citations through January 16th. So that would, you know, put us at several hundred for the year if we keep up at this pace.
Thank you, Chief Kowchek. And I guess the question I'd have is, you know, within the bounds of the police department's budget and staffing, is an overtime detail sustainable, or is it more of a surge in force at certain times and then you know, lay off the overtime detail?
I mean, for now, I mean, we should be cutting down a lot on our shift coverage overtime. So the amount we're cutting down is going to be a lot more than what we're actually spending out on this overtime detail for speed enforcement. We'll see how it goes. If, you know, if we get halfway through the year and we determine that, hey, this has been very effective, been a big deterrent, that we could cut back on it or even cut it out. But for now, it's kind of an indefinite project.
Thank you. Any questions from members of the commission or council on the overtime detail? Councilman Schachter.
Chief Kowchek, just for council's information, if you have that number, about how much does each one of those shifts cost in overtime?
You know, I don't have that
Okay.
information with me tonight.
If you could provide it at a
Sure.
later date. Thank you.
Councilman Bullock.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So Chief, on that line of questioning, so I just want to make sure I heard you correctly. There were 12 possible shifts and some.
We
but not-
covered 8 of them.
8 of them. So the challenge with the overtime tool is that you face a bottleneck in staffing overtime for unrelated reasons having to do with how vibrant the city is, how staffing has been an ongoing project to do intake, training, manage retirements, et cetera, plus other overtime demands for things like Light Up Lakewood, the wonderful downtown. So on an overtime shift, there's 1 or 2, or how many?
One person per
One
shift.
person, okay.
Yeah. So 9 hours a week, so it'd be 3 officers working 3-hour shifts.
So we did 8 overtime shifts. That means 9 hours per week. Is that right?
8 overtime shifts would be 3 hours per shift, so 24
Okay.
hours total.
Spread across how long?
Yeah.
The month of
It's basically
December?
been 4 weeks because we took off
Okay.
when school was out of session.
Okay. So first part of December, first part of January so far. Okay. So the idea would be keeping up that rate throughout the year.
Yeah. I
Okay.
think it'll only improve to get the officers to fill the shifts. Like I said, with Christmas, that was a little, you know, a lot of guys want to work right up to Christmas, you know,
Okay.
so.
What's wrong with just having our regular duty patrol officers run speed? Because they're
Every-
staffed already and you don't have the overtime bottleneck.
Every day our officers run radar when they're not on a call
Okay.
or doing something else, but inevitably they get called away.
Sure.
So we can dedicate this 3 hours just to
Okay.
radar.
That's a good reminder. Right, so they do some, but
Yeah.
because they're also responding and doing a bunch of other duties, it's not as comprehensive. Is that accurate?
Right, they can't
Okay.
devote the time that maybe they should be devoting to it. So like I said, we have 26 speeding citations through this grant, or through this overtime detail. And let's say we did half of those in December. That means we had 13 this year, but we have 59 speed citations for the year so far for the department. So our officers are writing other tickets.
Okay,
You know?
okay, good context, thank you.
Yeah, and I Director Vargo and I were having coffee on Friday morning, or Thursday morning, and speeding citation right in front of us, in front of Panera, so.
Good.
You guys must have knew we were there or something.
Glad to hear it.
And then I was walking my son to school at Hayes, and also someone was pulled over on Delaware for speeding in the school zone, so. Not sure if that was planned or not, but I think that, to your point, and we've had this discussion before, and I certainly appreciate it, Chief Kowchek, is that, you know, there are many ways to change habits of motorists, and one of them is seeing someone write a ticket and seeing, you know, officers present and being out there. So certainly appreciate everything the force has done to do that, and appreciate your efforts. The one thing, and this kind of ties into the next discussion point, is just, you know, it sounds like the hours of 8 to 9 and 3 to 4 are high volume times for, regular officers responding to calls and what else, because, that's when folks are home before work and after work. So that's where I think, school zones are uniquely, particularly during school hours, are uniquely situated for potential cameras. Particularly when you look at it, the fact that in two of the ones we studied, which is the limited data set, you have 25% and 34% of the cars going not just over the school zone limit of 20 miles per hour, but flagrantly over, more than 10 miles per hour over. That's where I see, it may be worth our time to think about assisting law enforcement so that they could devote resources in other areas of the city that may have speed problems, not just school zones, so that the school zones could be more protected with these cameras. But I'd certainly be willing, I'm one of 7 council members, so would love my colleagues and the administration's take on that. From a high level, I'm wondering if Law Director Vargo could kind of explain what we need to do if we wanted to do cameras, just bullet point, so that council and the public can understand kind of the steps you have to take to do it. If you'd be so willing, Director Vargo.
Sure, and certainly at the next committee meeting, I can have an exhaustive list of bullets, but I will tell you first and foremost is the 3-year study. So if we're moving in this direction, we'll want to get started on that just as soon as possible. And we can credibly, in my judgment, use data that was collected on an organized basis thus far through our calming program, to your point, Councilman Bullock. But the school zones is where we're going to, as I understand it, move forward potentially. And so the cameras had to have been up in the school zone. So to the extent there's no cameras, or not cameras, but facilities. Data collectors, yes, the terminology, have not been in those school zones. We need to get that started right away. We cannot extrapolate data from other locations, obviously, to the extent we would want to go with a camera in each of our school zones. So that's first and foremost. Second of all, we would decide, do we want handheld cameras or pole-mounted, or a combination of both? We would speak to vendors who sell this. Generally, vendors will take 30% of the gross revenue of the ticket written. So that's the cost for it. If we go that way, there is signage requirements that we have to invest in and keep up in the school zone, alerting the motorists that we do have traffic cameras. It's a unique requirement in the Ohio statute because these are, they can create emotion from somebody ticketed on the basis of a camera. So the statute requires extreme notice to the residents, and you do it by signage prior to the operation of the cameras. There's also a grace period. We put the cameras up, and there can be no citations written for a certain period. There's a period of warnings so that the residents have fair warning that this is being put up. Most importantly, and this gets into the issue of the law enforcement resources, we are required by statute to have an officer present at each of the cameras to the extent that camera is up and running, and we intend to issue citations on the basis of that. So whatever savings we get, we may not, we'll see what the numbers are, but the savings of law enforcement time may not be so great versus between the cameras and the overtime detail that the chief just laid out. It would be really the revenue generation that would compensate for that increased officer time. We would, the citations, as you know from our last presentation, are entirely civil. There will be no criminal citations issued through the use of traffic camera by virtue of the statute. The city will prepay court costs for any civil citation that is issued. And we are not able to recover that from the resident. So we'll be strictly dependent on the revenue created by the ticket itself.
Could also be non-resident.
Yes, I'm using that too generically. Thank you for that. The driver. So our costs would be the vendor costs, the court costs, and our prosecutors would prosecute this, even though it's civil. It's really not. It's not a prosecution at all. But they would process it. And the court would have to be comfortable with the evidentiary value of the cameras. It creates defenses that don't exist when an officer pulls over a driver. But those are all manageable issues that an orchestrated process will have to take care of. And I apologize, there probably are other criteria, but certainly I will have an itemized list for you, Councilman, to the extent we meet again, and certainly as we roll this out, to the extent that's the direction we take. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And you looking over your memo you created back in November, you largely covered everything that was in there. Just kind of wanted to understand that it's a little bit of a process, and there are steps you need to take if that is what the direction we decide to go. You know, so one of the things, you know, I think would be helpful, and I had a discussion with Assistant Director Boss about this, you know, I'd like to see some more data, particularly between November and now. To Chief Kalchek's point, you know, school had break. You know, I'd be interested in perhaps getting a couple more school zones, some data from them, so that we could have a little bit more of an informed discussion sometime, you know, in April or May with more data and more information that we could, because this is a serious change for residents and non-residents alike that drive through Lakewood. This would be a pretty serious thing we're doing, but you know, I think the data needs to lead us to the result that we take. And I'd be interested in gathering more of it so we can understand that. And you know, the agenda highlights, you know, at least in Mayfield, you know, they had some reduction of extreme speeds, you know, for their photo enforcement. You know, so other municipalities in and around Northeast Ohio are doing this. Any other questions or thoughts from the members of the committee or other council members on this point? No? One of the things I'd like to bring up, and I'd like to set aside, we have 2 people signed in for public comment, is, you know, there was, and it isn't really related to speed enforcement. I guess it's related in the sense that if the speed limit is lower, then the enforcement will be different. But, you know, Cleveland Heights recently reduced in certain streets the speed limit from 35 to 25 using what was not entirely clear to me in the Cleveland.com article as a legal basis of why they were doing it or you know, how they were claiming their ability to do it. So I guess I would look to Director Leininger or Director Vargo. Have we looked into that to see if it's something that is possible for Lakewood, or is that still an ongoing question that we're considering?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I'll address that, and if Director Leininger wants to add something, he's free to do. We have reviewed the ordinance that Cleveland Heights adopted. We're researching it now. We're going through the Ohio statute to see what they did. Obviously, as reported in a newspaper and as clear from the ordinance, the city redesignated streets, redesignated them from through streets to non-through streets. So the legal question is, how were they able to do that consistent with the law? We're looking at that now. The second part of the research is, what are the implications? Because as we know from the speed cameras, a municipality can set the speed cameras up outside of school zones, but there are implications that deter the use. We want to study the implications of redesignating any street to be a non-through street. We just need some time. We were made aware of this last week. We have assigned the research, and I think we need, given the significance of it and the analysis required, a good 3 to 4 weeks to totally master the research and be in a good position to advise the administration and council on next steps.
Thank you, and I appreciate that, and didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I figured it would come up in public comment as well, so it's good to have kind of, you know, an assurance that we're looking into it and, you know, exploring our options to see if it's something that is feasible here in Lakewood. I'm wondering if declaring something a through street is the same way as we declare emergencies here on council. It's just because you said it was, but interested in that analysis. Councilman Bullock?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So I think, I mean, my views are pretty clear based on, you know, really trying to be a little R representative for the public, which consistently is telling us speed for every reason, safety and nuisance and all the rest is a chronic issue in Lakewood. And so starting with Lake Avenue, you know, we've got pending legislation. You know, I talked to the ODOT personnel guy 3 years ago, and he had a long conversation with me, but I stood my ground, and his punchline was, we're the boss, don't do anything different. But I battled him back to saying, but these other cities have done it too. He's like, yeah, and he conceded, where there's a will, there's a way. I think the answer that we're going to find is that it's a blended jurisdiction between the locality and the state is going to have its enforcement and its monetary strings that it can attach to those streets over which it has some jurisdiction. But the cities still have our decisions to make. And so, you know, I suspect that where we're going to arrive is where the conversation has begun, which is that if cities, if communities believe this is important to do, we have some ability to improve safety, including through addressing speed limit. It may come at a cost of certain things, but those costs can be worth it. And if we just do it ODOT's way, it's going to be a long time. You know, I mean, they put molasses in January to shame. So we study and we study and we study, but you know, we gotta act at some point. I think that, you know, I hear my colleagues and I hear the administration. For sure, doing a solid analysis is prudent, important. I agree with it. It's just that I think I've already gotten to the stage where I'm clear on the direction that I'd like to go, which is to move forward with action to improve the quality of the neighborhood and all the rest. It'll take some effort, and I also respect the fact that there are different, you know, people here. I'm just one of 7 on council and one of 8 elected officials, so there's a range of perspectives. But I don't want to view this decision as we'll check with ODOT to find out what the answer is, because I think it's a local government decision too. ODOT has control over some parts of the discussion, but the local government has control over much of it too, and what we think is important. Thanks.
Yeah, and I'm just, you know, I think let's give Director Vargo some time to dig in, and then we can have those. I think they're valid points.
I was looking at Director Vargo, but I've talked with ODOT and others too. So I wasn't directed at our law department.
Yeah, in my other life, I can understand the challenges with ODOT. You know, but they're tasked statewide, and you know, we're one of many to them. I think what I will say is creativity and, you know, the willingness to be bold, I think maybe what's called for here, but we'll see what the research bears out and then see what risk there is to that boldness and then make a decision as to what we want to do. Any other comments from Councilwoman Marks?
Thank you. I would just like to comment, Director Vargo, that Edgewater is not a through street, and I think some consideration needs to be given there to lower that speed limit, because it's been a continual problem, and it is not a through street. So if we could advance that more quickly, I'd like to see that happen. Thanks.
Councilman Scheckner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to say that I do appreciate the conversation, the efforts that the administration has gone through. It's clearly well thought out. I really do appreciate Chief Kalchek dedicating some of his forces, some of his personnel to essentially do a pilot on specialized enforcement in our school zones and get those covered. So I know that's not an easy thing to manage or do. So I do appreciate that. And I think with this that we're really moving the ball forward a bit. I know in the past that we have written communications or put up legislation and there's an answer, then we kind of sit back and wait to see what happens. But I think from what I see today that there is real movement and a real effort to get something concrete and make sure that we're doing the right thing and find creative ways where we can not only enforce the speed limit, but maybe even alter them. So thank you, I appreciate that.
Thank you, Councilman Scheckner. So at this point, I'll open up the public comment. We'll go ahead and do 2 minutes per public comment, just because it's not a general council meeting. So the first person signed up is, I believe it's John Mazette. Is that correct? Mays, okay. And that must be, the ET must be just a different subject. John Mays, come on up. So, name, address for the record, and then state what you'd like to state.
My name's John Mazy, 12117 Franklin Boulevard, 44107. White House, blue trim, right next to Sam's Food and Beverage. I've spoken with Councilwoman Marks as well as responded to the city's webpage to comment about traffic calming on Franklin. Y'all got a lot in the works. A couple of thoughts I'd like to add. Right out front here, there's a crosswalk. Vehicles have to stop for pedestrians. Put one in front of Sam's. They're an attractive nuisance. They get a lot of foot traffic. That's going to slow this driver, that driver, and the 7 behind them. I happened up Clarence in between Detroit and Franklin. Ran across a speed mat or plate. I guess this is the new version of a speed bump. Couple them up on Franklin, you'll slow people down. Doesn't require overtime labor hours. And it saves lives. I've lived there 14 years. We've had a couple, 3 accidents. Guy on a motorcycle, kid walking around got hit by a car. Before we get a body count, see if we can fix them. And on a side note, the city does not have a bike rack. I rode my bicycle here this evening. I'm chained up in a pipe out back. I did clear it with the police department because y'all got bolt cutters. All the service the city's paying to Green, we're going to be environmentally friendly and forward. You want people on bikes, give them a place to park. That's it, folks. And I would like to apologize. My CPA's working overtime. That's the phone call. Any questions of me?
Oh, sir, I believe there's a bike rack, but it's on the other side of the building. Where is it
I
at?
came in here, rode around, went up, talked to the cop at the desk. She said, I don't know. Came back here, found the pipe, chained the bike up, called the cop up, said, I'm back here, please don't take my bike. I'm hoping it's there when I leave.
Thank you, sir.
Where is this bike rack?
I believe it's on the west side of the building.
Are you talking out by the bus stop?
No, I'm talking by the entrance, where you go into the municipal court.
Did not see that one.
Okay.
Might help if the cops at the desk knew that, because I did ask before I chained it up to the pipe in the back.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
And then Cindy Snyder is also signed in for public comment. So, hello, Cindy, how are you? Get your name and address for the record, and then go ahead and give your public comment.
Cindy Schneider, 11846 Lake Avenue. My home sits probably in the middle between 117th and Cove. So I'm very excited to hear that you all are going to get some serious consideration to looking at alternative ways to get Lake Avenue to be a 25-mile-per-hour zone. That's all I'm going to say. I'm very excited to hear all of this. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Kyle, and thank you, Cindy. And if you want some firsthand input on why we want this to go on, we will be having a meeting at the Cove Center in February on a Saturday morning. I can let you all know when that's going to be, and you can come and talk to the residents. They'll be more than happy to share their feelings and what's been happening to them. So thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. Appreciate it. Any other comments or from the administration or from council on this issue? Without objection, I'll adjourn the meeting then. We have a couple minutes before committee of the whole. Thank you.